thank you very much, and thanks again to the Silicon Flatirons for inviting us here today. I think Jim and I were talking, we decided this is the funnest panel, so I'm putting a lot of pressure on my panelists. So we're here to talk about failures. The other groups talked about successes and failures, successes, so we get to kind of bring it home before we go towards the final speeches and the wrap-up and talk about what really went wrong and why. So with that, I have a great group of folks with me. Jim Lansford from Qualcomm, Blair Levin, who's with the Brookings Institute, Erin McGrath, who's Commissioner O'Reilly's office at the FCC, and in the cellular seat, Steve Sharkey from T-Mobile. So with that, we're going to start with, I have some questions. We're just going to do Q's and A's, and then, of course, we'll open it to the floor, and especially want to hear from the students. But starting with, how would you define a spectrum failure, and how do you think it takes to determine if spectrum policy is a success or failure? Because really, I think the other panels touched on this too. How do we make that determination? So maybe we can start with Jim and work our way down.
So first of all, I want to thank Pierre and Dale for inviting me to be on the panel today. It's always a pleasure to be up here. As some of you may know, I teach the Wi-Fi class in ITP. So I see some of my former students out there. And how many other ITP students do we have in the audience? All right, are you taking the wireless LAN class in the spring? Any of you taking the wireless LAN class in the spring? Yeah, I know. I've already got them backed into a corner. So they're terrified. Anyway, so thank you and welcome. We'll, I guess, to me, if you talk about failure, I guess I've done 3 startups, and one of the things that I tell my students is that there's no such thing as failure, only opportunities to learn. Right? And so within every problem lies an opportunity, and so within everything that you could call a spectrum policy failure, in fact, you've learned something in the process. So, you know, I think this has been alluded to earlier in the day, is that sometimes we have to take iterative approaches to try to figure out what's the right policy. So I was just, during the course of the day here, I was thinking about the things I've worked on over the years. I participated in the OmniPoint Pioneers Preference filing 25 years ago. I was on faculty at UCCS at the time and working for OmniPoint as a consultant, and so helped work on that. Let's see, 20 years ago I was at OET pitching wideband frequency hopping as an alternative to the 802.11b protocol, and we see where that went. I also was heavily involved in the ultra-wideband. I was CTO of one of the ultra-wideband startups, and UW, to Peter's point of view, there was over $400 million in venture capital poured into UWB, and I'm still working, so obviously I was not able to retire early from that. And I also was co-chair of the 802.15.3a standards group that was trying to standardize the UWB technology in IEEE. And I think I'm a candidate for the Dr. Kevorkian Award for that one. So it's been interesting. And of course now I work a lot in V2X. So I chaired the IEEE Tiger team that was trying to come up with Wi-Fi DSRC band sharing. And I found that you can't pack a room full of engineers and always get an agreement. So it's been interesting to see the things that have, some might call a failure, but in fact, it's part of the evolution of technology that you try things and some of them turn into successes, however you want to define that, pops per square kilometer or revenue per pop or whatever. And some of them, I think you learn what works and what doesn't, and that's sort of the nature of technology. I mean, to go back to my first statement, if you're in a startup company, you have to realize that you may not make it. Most startups don't make it. And so you try, and and you give it your best effort. And if it looks like it's not working, you either shift strategy, and as a startup, you want to try to have a nimble strategy. But sometimes you have to close up the doors and try a different alternative or do something different. So in terms of spectrum policy, ultra-wideband, for example, was one that was expected to be a huge multi-billion-dollar market, and one of the other CEOs and I were talking once. We ended up fighting over a $0 billion market. But it was something, I think we've applied a lot of that to learning how to do underlays and looking at noise floor considerations, especially to satellites. There was a lot of concern about how do you aggregate, how do you do steady aggregation, and how does that raise the noise temperature at the satellite and things like that. So we've learned a lot. I can't say that everything that we've done in wireless has been a commercial success, But on the other hand, I think it's part of the process of innovation that you have to learn and iterate and try to advance the technology for the better of society, whatever that means.
Blair?
So Jim gave a startup perspective. I'm going to give a perspective from having spent a lot of time the last 20 years working on Wall Street, or with Wall Street. I'm going to say a spectrum failure is a spectrum that no reasonable person can invest in. And if that is the case with the spectrum, that's probably all true. Here's what I mean by that. The worst use of spectrum is millions. But Tom Hazel was right. There are times where you want to hold it. And there are lots of people who invest in spectrum because they believe there's going to be some technology out here, so you hold on to it or whatever. But if policy, and there were several examples of this, some of the policies I've been involved in, so we'll get to that when we talk about which ones, but where you basically put the spectrum in a position where no reasonable person can invest in it, because it is a long policy process that is not at all about markets, not at all about technology, not at all about anything other than what a single bankruptcy judge or a majority of the commission decide to do. So that would be a leading indicator of that policy. And I think if you look at where you haven't delivered, as Larry was talking about, kind of economic aims, jobs, innovations, etc., it's often because spectrum is tied up in that way.
Thank you. Erin?
Someone who works on the regulatory side, and we were having an interesting conversation as to, it's easy for us with hindsight to go back and say that certain things were failures, but as, a lot of people have stated, it was an iterative process. Today if you told someone you were going to do some sort of lottery, they'd look at you like you were crazy. Back when we did beauty contests and lotteries, nobody knew what wireless was going to grow into. People didn't know that, this, at one point it was going to be this huge luxury item, and today it's something that everybody has. So, what I consider now, as we look at spectrum policy, what is a failure is if we make the same mistakes we made in the past. So, what do we look at that we know doesn't work? Are things where the commission's policies stop the spectrum from going to the highest use. So, as people have said in the successes category, flexible use is what, we see as being successful. Why is that? Because the commission doesn't have to regulate every time there's a technology change. That was a huge advancement over, I'll throw out some bans here because there are things that we still work on today. Things like AMTS, 220, Public Coast. Still not actually 100% sure what people were doing with Public Coast licenses. But today, what have we done with those? Through a series of actions, which actually one of them just happened this year, where we basically said, okay, you no longer have to get a waiver if you're using it for private purposes. Okay, so what does that do? A whole bunch of these bans were supposedly commercial. They never developed the way they are. They're now, a lot of them are being used by critical infrastructure entities. Our rules actually prohibited that. So now, you start moving the bans that we now, with hindsight, see as failures, towards a more flexible use plan that are used for means and reasons that nobody would have ever thought of. As Commissioner Rosenworcel started out with today, my favorite ban to say is a total failure is 5.9. Transportation industry came to us and said, well, of course, we need safe cars. Nobody is going to debate that we need safe cars. So we gave them spectrum on an idea. Well, we're going to have this technology where we're going to have, V to V, cars are going to be talking to each other, and then there's V to I, where somehow there's going to be infrastructure along every road in the country so that when the lights are going to change, your car's going to be able to know that. You're going to know where every pedestrian is, every work crew is. Sounds great. 20 years later, hasn't happened. You now have a DSRC standard in the rules, which is not actually the DSRC standard that people are working on, and then you have CV to X. And by the way, DSRC and CV to X, which different car companies are using different models at this point, they don't talk to each other. Mm-hmm. So in order for this to really work, all the cars need to be able to talk to each other, because even if you're like, to be effective, you need 50% of the cars, until that one car comes and crashes on you who doesn't have DSRC.
So things like that, luckily we've moved away from, especially the idea of we're going to give you spectrum and you're going to have no build out, you're going to have nothing, you can just sit on it. An example, and I will add this, just because Michelle Farquhar is in the room, is, what it really is different between the idea of DSRC and PTC for trains. So DSRC,
Acronym?
the acronym is different, and because you're from the commission.
Yeah, but you
PTC, of course, is positive train control. So it's the idea of putting infrastructure along the train tracks so they can figure out if there are incursions on the train tracks. If a train ahead of you was stopped, we'll allow the train to stop before you have a collision. Congress put that into effect. There was no spectrum band associated. So what happened, and this will tie my argument together, the railroads went and bought things like 220 megahertz and AMTS, bands that were meant for other things, but weren't being used. But we had turned now to flexible use. So that has proven to be a far more successful model, even though I'm sure Michelle would say that, that was probably not the easiest way to do things. But, we've moved away from earmarking spectrum for particular purposes, which, because technology like paging and things like that, we move past them, has proven to be far more successful. So if we would do something that would earmark spectrum, that would, in my consideration, be a failure.
Interesting. Okay. So Steve?
All good answers. And I think that's right. I guess I would just define success as the spectrum that is being used for some beneficial purpose, and the purpose that was either envisioned when it was allocated by the commission or the market has driven to, but that it's not sitting idly after the commission decision made available, but quickly to use sort of some purpose. Whether or not that's the highest and best purpose. There are certainly cases where the commission makes decisions about how the spectrum should be used. I will say the failures usually come when the commission is listening to a company with a great idea that just needs chunker spectrum to make it happen, or carving out special cases that seem like there's maybe something there, but the business case turns out to just not work out. Or when the commission tries to split the baby too many different ways and is tries to satisfy everybody, you end up with a suboptimal result.
All good answers. So, but a question, you all dodged one of my questions, which was timeframes. And especially Steve, you were talking about, quick to use. So there's bands that sometimes it just takes time for technology to be developed, right? And so some bands may not be efficiently used, and no one's talked about spectrum efficiency. Actually, throughout all the panels, it's not been a big focus. So I guess when you're talking about time and efficiency, is there a time frame where we want to see things happening, or is that not part of a failure? And
Well, I think it's got to be part of it, right? Because it's, when the commission, generally for commercial licenses are build out requirements, right? So you've got time frames associated with that. And frankly, there's probably could be even more oversight over build out requirements and making sure that people aren't just sitting on a license until the end, that there is progress towards towards that build out. Those are usually, they have kind of a midterm build out at 5 or 6 years, and then a longer build out at 10 years in the license. But if you look at some of the allocation decisions where spectrum's been sitting for 20 years or so, I was going to use an example that hopefully doesn't give me trouble with the public safety community, but something like 4940 and 4950 megahertz, right? The commission's got a procedure now to look at potential changes to that. But that is, I forget exactly where that's allocated, but that's probably
2005.
What's that?
It was under Powell, so around 2005.
Right, and so that's not even, it's over 10 years, but, sort of well into 20 years or so, but clearly there's been not a lot of growth, right? This is a band that the idea was you have a dedicated band for public safety for kind of low power, really Wi-Fi types of applications that would be a but a protected managed band for public safety. It's a very niche market, it's taken off. There's extremely low use of that band, and I would call that a failure. And something that you would look at and say, there should be something done to, put that spectrum to more productive use. And, you've got to consider public safety in some way to accommodate them, but this is clearly not it, that they're not using.
Well, can we stay on that for a second, though? Because I think Erin and you both agreed, putting spectrum aside for specific use, whether it's utilities or, positive train control, or whatever, may not be the best spectrum policies. So the question is, should we still be doing things like making spectrum available for public safety, or is that a special case where, not trying to get anyone in trouble with the public safety community, but are there times where that still may be a valid spectrum policy? Maybe it's not focused on public safety, but maybe for utilities or another use. And really going, if you think about it, and for those of you who may remember, Tom Titch always felt there should be, for satellite, a general satellite service, that you shouldn't have a fixed or mobile allocation. And I guess just building on that, should we be moving away from these very specific allocations of spectrum and trying to find ways to generalize them? I mean, the differences between fixed and mobile are really becoming one and the same. You can see that with the UMFUs for 5G, right? That's a fixed and mobile service that the FCC's made available in Spectrum Frontiers. So just a thought on that.
I think there's some cases like safety where it's hard to say that a shared band it makes sense, right? One of the big debates in DSRC, for example, is, and I lived for 18 months doing this, is how do you share Wi-Fi with the DSRC when in fact DSRC is sending safety messages between vehicles, and you really don't want to have interference corrupting those packets, right? Because it decreases range, you're going to have all kinds of issues there. But then the larger question is, so there's sometimes I say to people, harmful interference is in the eye of the beholder, right? The FCC has has this concept of harmful interference, but in fact, the DSRC folks said anything above minus 95 dBm or minus 100 dBm is harmful interference to them. It was the same issue in the TV white spaces. Anything above minus 124 dBm or whatever was harmful interference. If you're in the incumbent, then there is no, you want to put that floor way down there. And I think that's been the problem is, for safety, sometimes you may really want to protect spectrum from interference. But if it's best effort kind of traffic, I think Wi-Fi is a perfect example of, you should give a lot of flexibility there because it really does create a lot of economic opportunity.
So I want to say something, but I'm really kind of embarrassed about it. So and if you students want to believe that Washington is really a wonderful place, you might want to close your ears for this. I'm going to give you an example of why you might want to give public safety spectrum. When I got to the FCC the first time in '93, one of the big things up was the digital television transition, which, by the way, was then called the high definition television transition. We changed the name. But it was very clear that the current commission rule was the broadcasters would keep both sets of spectrum for 30 years minimum. And it was vague beyond that. And it was very clear that the broadcasters intended to keep all the spectrum forever and run on two things. So we said to ourselves, we need to have somebody who has an interest in completing the digital television transition, who has political swag, roughly equivalent to the broadcasters. So we hired a very distinguished lawyer to run a commission on the public safety needs, and lo and behold, he recommended that we allocate some of this spectrum that was going to be freed up because of the digital dividend to the public safety community. And who were the greatest allies when it finally came time to actually define an end date, not 30 years, but 10 years? And so that's one of those examples where, I don't know, is it principled? Is it spectrum policy? But it worked, so. That's an example of when you want to give the public safety community spectrum.
And it was a success, not
And it was a
failure.
success in its own inimitable fashion.
Erin or Steve, anything to add?
I mean, obviously, we've gone through several manifestations of providing spectrum to public safety uses. I mean, some of us were there for the D-block auction. That was not what I think we would consider to be a success. So, and now we have FirstNet. So that is supposed to, take care of a lot of the needs for the public safety community. So, of course, it is not quite up and running yet. So I think, going forward, we have to consider how that works.
Yeah, and I think that's the point is, because it's the same thing we struggle with federal agencies, right? It's how do they do their mission and make sure you adopt policies that ensure that they can achieve their mission, not necessarily give them a chunk of spectrum and let them, that's not necessarily the best way to do that. I mean, in the case of public safety, they've traditionally built their own systems. Those systems last for 20 or 25 years. The technology doesn't change, and it's not a particularly efficient way to run that. Now, so if there's a better way to make sure that they can get the service they need with the assurance of, that they don't get interference, they get priority, but they get the latest technology, and obviously that's the idea of FirstNet, that you've got a more commercial model applied to it with a company that will upgrade the system and the technology and make sure that they've got services. So I think that approach shifts, but it's difficult. And I will take on Blair's point on public safety in clearing the 700 megahertz, and that is what made that gave an end date to the DTV transition and was critical to having it. I mean, that whole longer debate really resulted in a failure of a band plan for 700 megahertz. I know Charlotte disagrees with me on this, but the U.S. has got a very...
Disagree, the band plan is bad.
Okay, right. So the U.S. has a unique band plan for 700 megahertz, and that spectrum all came out of TV broadcast spectrum. And so we had analog television, digital technology was adopted, digital standard was adopted in 1997, and there was an opportunity to free up a lot of spectrum. The FCC originally identified a portion of that, but then went back and figured out we could clear a lot more than they had originally identified, 108 megahertz. But in the meantime, Congress had looked to it to help balance the budget, so they started to define dates for when that spectrum should be auctioned. You had a public safety allocation that was kind of put in the middle of it, and all of these factors, and we were looking at it and saying, this is a terrible band plan. You ended up with a bunch of guard bands to protect between public safety, to protect between upper 700 and lower 700, and I think if we went back and looked at that, or at the time could have looked at it without all the competing forces that were there, we would have ended up with a very different band plan. And in fact, the rest of the world ended up with a very different band plan that looks at all that spectrum and just has a very clean allocation, which Mexico adopted. And now we've got a big interference problem as Mexico begins to use that under a band plan that conflicts with a U.S. band plan that when they looked at it, they saw nobody in the rest of the world, other than Canada, going with us. And so we've developed into a long-term problem that is continues to this day.
So that's a great lead into my next question, which is on process. How important is process to avoiding spectrum failures? That one you just said was Congress got involved and we ended up with a less than ideal band plan, but thanks to Blair in part, we had incentive auctions, which it turned out to be very successful, and that did require legislative change. The FCC got original authority for auctions. We've heard today that that was very successful. We've seen other things. FirstNet was certainly come out of a statutory requirement. That jury's still out on how successful that will be. But from a process standpoint, and then there's things 700 where it wasn't terribly successful, at least the band plan, we have a difference of opinion on some issues, but the band plan, there's agreement that that was maybe not as perfect as could be. So in terms of process, I don't really mean process in that you file pleadings, but how important is process in all of this in making spectrum decisions?
Well, I think it's very important because the last panel kind of said if the commission establishes sort of the ground rules, and unless the secondary market gives them some flexibility to play within the rails, that really creates a lot of, I think, a lot more opportunities to move forward, the technology forward. I think back, I spent a lot of time in the 5.9 band, and if you look at the regulations, it's very prescriptive. There's an ASTM E2213-3 document that is prescribed for that band, period, end of discussion. You can't use anything else in the band. And it's been very limiting, because that spec is actually obsolete now. And so even IEEE is working at updating the 11P specification, because it's quite old now. It's over 10 years old. So, and 11P was based on 11A, which is now 20 years old. And so by hardwiring things into the regulations, it really, I think, does create an impediment to successful use of the band.
There, comments?
Erin? I mean, I would say that in the process that the commission mostly uses, which is flexible use, plus options, plus secondary markets, is the ideal model for ensuring that spectrum is used efficiently, because each company goes in, they have a technology, and they know what spectrum needs, and they bid for that. Whereas, to pick 5.9 again, as you said, and you said, talking about, chunks of spectrum, 5.9 is for automobile safety. They have 75 megahertz. Well, there's a lot of debate as to how much spectrum is actually needed for automobile safety. It seems to be somewhere between 10 and 30 megahertz. It's certainly not 75. So, it's a more efficient allocation if companies actually have to come in and bid for what they want.
Can I follow up on that as a satellite operator? I can't resist, sorry. And in the United States, statutorily, it's prohibited for auctions for international space stations. So do you think that that's something that, and there's other services, broadcast television is not auctioned, there's other services that don't have auctions. So do you think that in those cases we end up with worse decisions perhaps because of that?
Well, I mean, obviously,
You can answer after Mr. Sharkey.
Yes. I mean, I would answer it this way, that spectrum should go to its highest and most efficient use. And so what have we seen over the years is broadcasters selling their spectrum in the incentive auction. Satellite companies have, decided to switch their spectrum to terrestrial uses. So, I mean, are there better methods probably to allocate that spectrum? Yes, but those entities are incumbents, and that is their spectrum at this point. So, you have to work with, the reality that you have.
Okay, no, very fair. Steve?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that auctions have been a good way to allocate spectrum, right, and to determine the use. And actually, in broadcast, they do hold auctions if they file for the same market, right? If there's a
And we do for
complicated-
DBS too and DTH, right?
Right.
So there are exceptions in satellite.
Yeah, so I think and some of the other panels talked about it, right? I mean, I think the terrestrial community and satellite community conflict more and more on spectrum allocations as we're both kind of moving up in the bands and looking for more and more. And I think particularly now where the satellite companies are positioning services that compete against terrestrial, right? I mean, that is how those systems are sold, as broadband services that are, promising gigabit speeds and, aimed at competing with both wired and wireless systems. I think it's very reasonable that if that's the case, there should be an auction for that spectrum under a flexible allocation with some general technical rules. Because all too often, what we've seen from the satellite community are very big promises that with business plans that don't pan out. And Erin mentioned, we've had many cases where satellite companies, after getting an allocation and not paying for it, there is no business case there. They've applied to use that for terrestrial services. So, we have a track record here and a history of the potential that can happen. So why do we keep repeating the past rather than moving to an auction to determine the amount? I mean, Spectrum Frontiers, we've got gigabits of spectrum that have been allocated to the satellite industry under those promises. And I do think in that case it would have been appropriate to have an auction for it.
And Jim?
but I'll make a plug for unlicensed spectrum. To what Rob Aldifer said earlier, the unlicensed is also a very important part of spectrum policy. Some of you probably remember, and Julie mentioned the unlicensed PCS band. There was an idea that they were going to tax every radio for like 50 cents or something like that, right? And UTAM was the organization that was going to do this?
They had to pay for the relocation.
Yeah, and so there's going to be a tax on every unlicensed radio, and everybody, all the chip companies said, no way in hell are we going to do that. So if the Wi-Fi companies had to pay to use the spectrum today, that would probably kill. That would be very damaging to the Wi-Fi ecosystem, I'd say. So yeah, unlicensed is also important.
Okay, great.
Although that's, I mean, it's a fair point, but I do think, I mean, like for UTAM, it was actually successful, right? I mean, there was, a device fee charge because there were clearing costs associated with moving the incumbents, and that did turn out to be a success. It's not whether or not you're charging for use of the spectrum itself, it's to make that spectrum available, and I do agree.
But there was a big pushback.
Yeah, and I do agree there's certainly an important place for unlicensed spectrum. But that is different because it's shared equally amongst everybody rather than exclusive licenses.
Right. Nobody gets priority.
Right.
So in terms of things we can learn from failures, we always say, look, or your mother always said, my mother always said, take a look and see what you've learned from doing this wrong. Can you give me an example and perhaps a lesson that came out of it? And maybe we'll start with Steve and just go backwards. Or
I thought I was going to have time to
no,
think
you
about
did.
this.
I was especially after going out, proposing auctions on satellite.
I think, I mean, I guess there's because I had a couple of we talked about 700 megahertz, and I think just making sure that there's a process in place to, have a real look at what's the best decision here that isn't driven by so many external forces. I think we do get a lot of decisions are driven by congressional need for auctions, and they use it to balance the budget, which has got its benefits and downside, right? I mean, the benefit is it does move the process along. There are very few reallocation decisions that have been made without some input from Congress and driven by those auctions recently. But they've also driven some less than desirable results. So I think to the extent that as we're moving forward, not micromanaging some of the decisions, and so, like for instance, if Congress is going to is looking for a certain amount of spectrum, it works better when they say, 200 megahertz of spectrum, find 200 megahertz of spectrum, and let's auction that, and then let the agency experts between NTIA and FCC figure out what the right place is for that and the right balance to make a service that isn't divided up between competing interests.
Thanks.
I think this also in part gets back to your original question of what do you define as a failure? There's obviously bands that we look at and go like, ooh, yeah, that wasn't one of our better choices. Besides like 5.9, I mean, and EBS BRS or the original ITFS, MMTS. Some of the things that are out there that we were just like, oh, WCS, I mean, that took us decades to sort out. But there are also decisions or policy decisions that are made that don't necessarily make the band a failure, but probably should have been reconsidered. Because I mean, as we said, nobody likes the 700 megahertz band plan, but does anybody actually consider 700 megahertz to be a failure? No. I mean, cellular is very successful. And this is part on auction policy, and on a band that was a fiasco, but PCS set-asides, C-block, next wave installment payments, I'm sure that just sends some people screaming out of the room. Those decisions on things like designated entity, credits, installment payments, set-asides, we've learned from those mistakes. I mean, obviously, we don't do installment payments anymore because we realized we were going to have a huge problem in bankruptcy. We realized that, maybe some of these, obviously we do, small business bidding credits. We try to help small businesses out. It's in the statute. But what we were originally doing wasn't necessarily helping small businesses. They were getting flipped to other entities. So over time, you tweak things here or there, but that's part of the iterative process. I consider some of those decisions to be failures, but you did learn from them.
Thank you. Matt?
Well, this is awkward, because,
I know.
no, look, it's awkward for me because I probably was involved with more failures than anyone else in this room, which is usually not a problem. I can talk my way out of it, but except for it's like we're 2 weeks from the Jewish Day of Atonement. So I really have to say, yeah, you're right. We really did screw up the C block. Or to quote Animal House, you fucked up, you trusted us. But no, actually, your points are all good. But I would say generally Washington actually doesn't learn anything. It's a curiosity. Yeah, but I'm going to talk about the C block in a second. But first, I just have to make fun of Chairman Pai for a little bit, not for a substantive thing, which we could do that too. But I won't. He went to Oregon the other day with Walden, the Chairman Walden, and they put out a big press release about how they went out to Oregon and they learned all these incredible things. And you know what they learned? They learned that farmers need broadband and rural hospitals need broadband and other people living in rural Oregon need broadband. And I'm thinking to myself, how long have you been in this business? You really need to travel cross country on the taxpayer dollars to learn that? I don't think so. But that kind of shows you the way Washington learns. The interesting thing about the C block, and we did screw it up, is that they're really...
Just give a thumbnail of what...
So the C block, we did the first really big auctions in started in December 94 with the A and B block, which went to everybody. And then there was a C block, which started in spring of 95, which went to so-called designated entities, small businesses, women, minorities. And so I would say there were 3 different levels where you could say, it's kind of like, it was a murder. It's like the murder happens on the first page of the novel, and the only thing you're trying to figure out is what really was the cause of the murder. One way of thinking about it is it's fundamentally flawed to simply have designated entities for auctions. It may have been true if we were doing broadcasting, where you want diversity of voice, that makes sense. But in a world where, let's face it, this is a scale business. What are we talking about here? So you could look at that set of failure. That's an interesting debate. I don't think we've really had that robust debate. A second thing is the way we allow the small businesses to be financed. And basically, if you have rules that keep them truly small businesses, you cut off their access to capital and then they don't succeed. And then you give them access to capital and it turns out that it's either Dish or it's AT&T who's paying for it. And so we go through these cycles. So that would be the second thing. And I don't think we've solved that problem yet. I think with every auction, we go through that. The third thing was the installment payments. But even there, I would argue, this was enormously painful, the failure was, the bankruptcy thing, that actually could have been solved. We screwed that up too. But, we screwed up a lot of things in the C block. But the A and B block was so good. Anyway, it's a really interesting point, and I think what we failed was the game theory of it. In the A and B block, if you overbid for spectrum, because you were with a big company, if you overbid, you lost your job. For the C block, if you did not overbid, you lost your job. That is to say, they had an incentive to bid as high as possible because otherwise they're out of business because they're all new companies. And when we gave them basically a 90% bidding credit, we just gave them all the incentive in the world to just run it up. If it had been a 50% or maybe a 30%, it might have worked. We're never going to run that experiment again, so we'll never know. But my point is, really the mega point is, one of the things that Washington does worst is learn. One of the great joys, and Jennifer worked with me on this in the National Broadband Plan, was we actually had the luxury of sitting there and going, okay, we're going to look at it from like 2020, we did this in 2009 and 10. We're going to look 10 years out and then work backwards. What are the problems we want to solve that we can foresee easily today? And so we actually did get to study. We actually had wonderful people on the team doing it. but it's very rare, and it's even more rare in Washington these days, that anyone will say, look, we didn't get this right. What can we learn? It's everyone's in there just throwing stuff at each other. So it's really hard to actually to learn.
So thanks, and Jim, and then we'll open to the floor.
Okay. So what can we learn? I was just thinking that you know, your idea of having been an entrepreneur, it's like deal flow, right? You get if you're a VC, you want to see lots of deals come in, and you try to pick which ones you think are going to survive and which ones won't. Sometimes the past is not a good indicator of the future, and sometimes it is. In fact, we were talking during the break that if you'd gone back 35 years ago and asked, what's the economic value of the ISM band? You'd go, you know, plywood heaters in the 900 megahertz band of dry out plywood at a plywood plant. And yet now you look at the economic value of Wi-Fi and say, wow, it's phenomenal. So it's really hard to predict. So you know you're going to make mistakes in the future because you try to learn from your mistakes in the past, but you probably, the future is never exactly like the past. But I think this idea of flexible use, you know, for those of you who had my class, you know, that we talk about the Shannon capacity limit, right? And this was the maximum, the best spectrum efficiency you could hope for is the Shannon limit. And then MIMO came along and it kind of blew outside of the water. I used to say, one of my famous sayings was that Moore's law doesn't apply to spectrum. And yet now what we have is with MIMO, it's not quite Moore's law, but it does allow us to pack a lot more capacity into what we thought was a fixed byte. You can't bet on those kind of innovations. You can't say whether, you know, we can't anticipate those. So.
Well, thank you. So we're going to open the floor open the mic open for questions with students first, preferably. So, okay, you were first. Just wait for the microphone.
Sorry. Thanks. So I believe it was the last panel stated that state regulation.
By yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Blair. I'm a 2L here. That state regulation is ineffective due to the threat of interference. And today you all mentioned that we now have interference happening across borders. So my question is whether we should be moving towards more international band regulation, and if so, what that might look like, and how we can learn from our mistakes in implementing that.
There you go.
Well, there's a ginormous can of worms.
Here's the ITU expert right here.
So we do have, so there's an organization in Geneva, Switzerland, where I just spent 11 days of my life.
That you won't get back.
Which I will not get back. The International Telecommunications Union, which is responsible for spectrum allocations globally. It's a non-binding treaty. It's an organization. It's a part of the UN. And to be honest, I think they'll all deny it if anyone ever quotes me. The ITU does a very good job at what it does. And countries, to be honest, countries have an incentive to ensure that there's not interference. So in the case of 700 megahertz, where we have differing band plans, Mexico and the United States spend a significant amount of time trying to reach agreements. So overall, we try to harmonize spectrum, and harmonization is something that I think is critical on a global level, both for non-terrestrial satellite and other non-terrestrial technologies, and for terrestrial technologies. We get a lot of benefits, economies of scale, we get limits on harmful interference, but at the end of the day, a lot of that is done on a bilateral basis across borders. And so I don't think you'll ever get away from that, because there's an issue of sovereignty, and countries like to be sovereign. We were just talking about planes flying over China, and how when you fly over China, you can't use the Wi-Fi on airplanes, and that's because they're a sovereign country. It's not that any satellite operator stops operating, they just don't provide the service. So I don't think you'll ever get to a binding FCC internationally, nor do we want that. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't know if anyone...
WRC is an opportunity for you to have fun in that sandbox next year. So.
It's the World Radio Communications Conference, which is a 4-week treaty negotiation where you usually want to shoot yourself afterwards. And then the FCC gets to implement the decisions. And
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, obviously there are things that the ITU, especially in Jennifer's world, will be a little bit different probably than what Steve is going to say when it comes to ITU, because obviously satellites are in space, they can serve Europe, they can serve the US. Whereas when you're talking about wireless, I mean, you are obviously in a smaller geographic area. And that is where, pilots really do come into play because, we're lucky, we've got Mexico and Canada. Being a regulator from, Europe would probably drive me nuts because they have so many borders. And that is a place where we've run into problems with the ITU because, I'll use the 600 megahertz band for example. Obviously, we have auctioned the 600 megahertz band, the former broadcast, which will, now in part be used by wireless. We also made it clear, hey, we have broadcasters here too. That was vehemently opposed by most at the ITU. The United States did it anyhow because we had that ability to work with Canada and Mexico to make it work. Part of the reason why 600 megahertz was not really looked at by the ITU is because people were protecting their incumbent businesses. And so what did they adopt in part with the argument of interference was what created a domino effect, which was in order to support what the United States wanted for 600 megahertz, which it was to be able to reallocate towards wireless, you needed to get the sign-off of your neighbors. Therefore, what happens? Everybody starts playing games because I'm going to protect my industry. I don't care about your wireless industry. Oh, by the way, Europe is behind us in 4G deployment anyhow, so they're protecting their past investments too. So why should I upset my broadcast industry to maybe go for 4G when my guys are still trying to pay off their 3G investments? So while the ITU does have a role to play, and obviously, they do serve a purpose, it's not always nice and as clean cut as it sounds.
Yeah. Okay. Steve, do you
No,
want
I think they covered it. I mean, we're lucky that the U.S. is a large country with scale for markets and has limited borders that we have to deal with. But we all support harmonizing, international harmonization of spectrum. It helps all reasons that Jennifer talked about, the scale of equipment, being able to deploy quickly. We do look at what's going on in other countries and whether or not that spectrum can be made available because, and there is a little bit of push-pull, right? Sometimes we're the leader in making a band available and the rest of the world will follow us. Sometimes we look at what they're doing and we'll tend to follow them because it does make sense for the satellite industry to align around those allocations and for the defense industry to try and align around some of those allocations. So there's a tendency to kind of coalesce. And it's not a perfect process, but I think we do a pretty good job of it in most cases. And 700 megahertz is actually it's I think more of an outlier that we have such a different band plan with a neighboring country. And usually that wouldn't happen.
I'll just add real quickly, as a chipset company, having these really complicated band plans around the world just gives us migraines, right? It's just really makes our life really hard to try to build one chipset that can cover all.
Well, I think that was my final remark on this was going to be the growing importance, and not to sidetrack, of 3GPP, which someone asked a question, what was more important, Wi-Fi or 3GPP? But 3GPP, I think, is a standards body, for those who don't know it, who's working on the 5G standards. And their work is driving, in a lot of ways, maybe becoming as important, and it's a private standards body, so it's not a treaty-based organization, but in a lot of ways that's driving a lot of what's being considered at the ITU. And I think at Work 19, that's going to be one of the issues, is a lot of what's happening is 3GPP is ahead of the ITU on some of the standards work, and so it may be driving what's going on. But
and as a company that makes both Wi-Fi and cellular chips, this gives us migraines, right? Is that we're having to deal with different parts inside the company are trying to do the spectrum grab, right? And the 6 gigahertz band coming up is going to be a classic case of that. So we have some very interesting internal meetings.
so,
But there are also tuning ranges.
Yeah.
okay. This is another question. Yes, sir. To break up this conversation.
Thank you. Scott Fox again. I wanted to ask, there's been most of the conversation has been around success criteria or successes and failures. There's been some discussions around the appropriations as stimulating the movement of the process. But I was thinking of an example, the AWS-3 spectrum auction that occurred in 2015, I believe it was. It brought in $45 billion. is it, I'd love to hear conversations around that side of it, right? That $45 billion, $7 billion of that went to fully fund, or it wasn't quite 7, but fully fund FirstNet. So are things like that appropriate to consider in the success or failure criteria of a spectrum policy process?
Thank you.
So the FCC is not supposed to consider how much money will be made in an auction, right? The foundation of the auction was supposed to be to put the spectrum to the best and highest use. The reality is it becomes a factor, right? I mean, and Congress looks at that, $45 billion is a lot of money, and when they're trying to balance a budget, it becomes a factor. And that's, I think that's what really happened once they started to see how valuable that spectrum is. It became of more interest to them.
Well, it's also different when you have a statute that basically says you have to fund something.
Right.
I mean, there are a whole bunch of our auctions that don't necessarily come with that criteria.
Right. Well, but one of the good things that's also come out of auctions too is a lot of that money will end up going to relocating incumbents. So like AWS-3, right, a lot of it goes to moving the federal government out of there, making sure that they've got new systems and that they can move to other spectrum. So it helps that transition.
I would only add that in the mid to late 90s, when we were very close to balancing the budget and then did, Spectrum played a role because the budget people, they would like call me up and say, we're just short like 12.5 billion. Can you say that this band is worth 12.5? You know, so there was that kind of game going on. I think if you're looking at the kind of deficits we're looking at now, really, who cares? It's just not, it's not going to play the same role.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
It's a great conference. It's really good to hear people talk about UWB because I worked on that and it was really fun, but utterly painful, and it failed because Wi-Fi got better. I think that's really what it comes down to. I'm kind of wondering.
That was hard to beat, right?
Oh, yeah.
4x4 MIMO and 8x8 MIMO, you can do a lot with that.
Yeah. And you guys got the 802.15.3a standard wrong too. That didn't help, but.
I still have PTSD over that, so
But I was kind of disappointed I didn't hear as much bad mouthing of white spaces as I thought there was going to be, because to me it's sort of the poster child for a policy failure. It's what happens when you get a bunch of lawyers to design a network instead of engineers. But just to be a little contrarian, you know, most people, because I never do that.
You? Contrarian?
Yeah. You know, everybody's pretty gung-ho about 5G right now, except Silicon Valley kind of isn't, right? I mean.
Neither is Wall Street, by the way, but.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of that, I mean, it's probably going to succeed just because of the sheer number of companies that have bought into it, the number of countries that have bought into it. But some of the goals are kind of screwy, like the extreme, like millisecond latency. I mean, that's just ridiculous because that's not something you can't engineer around the speed of light. But is it possible that, say, in the 10-year anniversary of this conference, is there any scenario you can envision in which 5G is regarded as a policy failure?
Well, there's a bunch. I mean, we could have a whole conference on that. I mean, and I don't mean to trash 5G, but and again, this is just reflecting stuff I do on Wall Street. Number one, you don't see, when you look at the models for the companies, you're not projecting new revenues coming off of it. And these are not models that are like 20 years out or 10 years out. These are, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not at all clear what is the incremental revenue that is not simply the cannibalization of 4G, Yesterday, and I don't want to comment on anything since Erin's here that would cause me to have to file an ex parte. I'm just noting that yesterday there was a lot of discussion of a plan which or a document which says the companies are going to save $2 billion. Putting aside whether or not that's true, putting aside the point that also means city coffers that pay for cops and fire are going to lose $2 billion, because that's where the money's coming from. that's less than 1% of what the projected costs are. And it's not at all clear, you know, you got to do incremental CapEx versus incremental revenues. So I think it's not at all clear, other than, and this is a good thing, offering competition to cable in areas where you have sufficient fiber and density to be able to do that. But I don't think it's a spectrum problem. I don't think we'll look back, because I have confidence in Erin. I don't think we'll say we screwed it up in spectrum. I think there are conceptual errors of the way, I mean, it is funny how everybody uses 5G to justify the thing that they would have justified anyway. But it's, when we look at 5G leadership and we say, what is the real metric for it? What are we really trying to achieve? It's not at all clear that people in Washington have articulated that well. So I don't think there's really like a strategic plan. There's just a bunch of impulses and political machinations, and I think that's where we'll look back, but it won't really be about spectrum policy.
I think the one thing we've seen, though, is that when we make capacity available, people use it, and they use it for new things and different things.
New uses and new users.
Right. So the thing about 5G is that it is more efficient, and you know, it will provide greater capacity, and part of that is going to be new spectrum allocations. You know, when we look at the demand for, and you know, look out to 2024 or so, the majority of the demand is driven by applications that we meet today, and a lot of it's video, right? But we continue to see tremendous growth, but we have to grow that network to do it. And then you add a layer on top that's augmented reality or virtual reality or some of the other kind of really neat things that are talked about. And it's a relatively small layer at the top of that, but that current technologies are not really suitable for. So I think you know, whether or not those are cases that drive the huge demand and migration to 5G or not, there are other advantages to 5G that will drive its adoption. There were doubts about even 4G and 4G LTE and how much, how quickly that would take off and whether there would be demand there. That took off much faster than any of us anticipated. And you wouldn't have things like Uber where nowadays applications are developed just because there's an assumption that there is a network available anywhere.
Because you can.
What's that?
Because you can.
Because you can. Well, but they're beneficial and they're changes that can't be anticipated.
Right.
And the millisecond latencies are not, getting around the speed of light, but it is a fundamental redesign of the network. And those are not going to be at the beginning of 5G, but they're going to come as points are distributed closer to the edge, and you don't travel those kinds of distances as you're delivering that data. But I hear the skepticism, but there was a lot of skepticism on 4G, and I think as the demand continues to build, we'll see it. We'll see that take off. Although clearly there are a lot of applications, and LTE has a long life left in it, and a lot of these applications can be met by 4G technology.
So on this, I've been told our time is up. I think we're ending on a very interesting note, and I'm hoping that Pierre will invite us back in 10 years to come back and talk about
Yeah, right.
this. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists.